So let me just firstly acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm sitting on, the Ngunnawal people, and pay tribute to the elders past, present, and emerging. And this paper, it comes out of a chapter on a book on Christianity in the middle class in South Africa. I've got 8 weeks to finish it. No panic, no problem. The background issues are the moral ecology of the country, firstly, the emergence of a sizable black middle class in the post-apartheid era, secondly, and then thirdly, the question of what's going on with the established white middle class, sociologically speaking. And the book is concerned with how this works itself out in the field or context of Protestant Christianity, particularly within multiracial middle class Protestant churches in and around Cape Town. Now, I want to explore in a quite particular way, with a few key resources, a point made by Pierre Bourdieu in his book Distinction, that the most intense or interesting cultural conflicts for cultural ascendancy and social dominance, are not between the rich and the poor, but among the rich themselves. The conflict is over which form of capital is dominant. Is it just economic capital? Or is it, cultural capital like education or embodied knowledge? Which dominant art of living, which is a phrase of Bourdieu's, is going to dominate? And so there's an implicit competition between an affluent fraction of the new black middle class and the established white middle class. The South African economist Stampy Terreblanche includes both in his schema of South Africa's post-apartheid social divisions into a category he labels the bourgeois elite. It's about 16% of the population in Terreblanche's term. There's very different worldviews within this category of the elite, reflecting South Africa's history. And it's reflected in different forms of habitus, even among people who attend the same church. And now Bourdieu describes habitus as the durably installed generative principle of regulated improvisations. In simpler words, which you usually have to do with Bourdieu. Although, he does it himself a lot. It's interesting that over the decades, he is asked to kind of refine or re-articulate or clarify his position, partly also because of a desire to sort of maintain a certain control over his interpretation. So you rarely get sort of just one sort of definition of his key concepts. So in simple words, this habitus is our deeply ingrained understanding of the world and our place in it. And Charles Taylor, writing about the concept of habitus, explains our bodily know-how of the world and the way we act and move can encode components of our understanding of ourself and our world. Now, Bourdieu locates a particular kind of casualness or disinterestedness in the cultural practice of some members of what he calls the dominant class. It's a consequence of the self-certainty which accompanies the certainty of cultural legitimacy. So the real measure of cultural authority is the extent to which someone's relationship with their own body, as Bourdieu writes, and I necessarily heavily paraphrase, allows them to move in the world with ease in circumstances that would make another person feel extremely awkward. Now, Bourdieu is particularly concerned with class in the formation of habitus, but he also recognizes a plurality of visions and divisions, including religion. And religion can also give rise to a secondary habitus or a cleft habitus that you learn later in life. Thomas Chodas, applying these concepts to charismatic Catholicism, says that Christian habitus will regulate the kind of responses someone is likely capable of, defining the limits of reality or defining the limits of your understanding. So this paper is particularly concerned with the white middle class who live in lives of far greater ease than political discourse would suggest. The Afrikaner theologian Cobus van Vingard, and that's a very Afrikaner name, very Afrikaans name, Cobus van Vingard, is highly critical of this discourse of South African whiteness emphasizing victimhood. noting that white approaches to salvation have relied upon treating black life as of lesser importance. He suggests a South African's approach to violence can be a litmus test of their lived theology. It can also be a way of understanding their ordinary ethics, a term popularized by Michael Lambeck. I have seen how casual speech and acts differs from official statements or views prompted in interviews or surveys. The apparent plight of white South Africans has been folded into this global discourse of white vulnerability. Partly as a response to anxieties over immigration, partly over economic stagnation. 2018, Australia's Home Affairs Minister Peter Dutton responded to a campaign by an Afrikaner chauvinist group declaring that white South Africans need help from a civilized country like ours. This, unfortunately, was around the same time that Australian cricketers were caught ball tampering in a test match against South Africa, which rather demonstrated who the truly barbarian nation is. And what struck me, though, during my field work in South Africa was the nonchalant attitude towards crime among middle-class white, Christian men that I was getting to know. For women, this was quite different, but the middle-class urban and suburban white men seemed to shrug it off as just one of life's irritations. And this was very puzzling to me initially. After a certain number of years living in South Africa, robbery is a practical statistical certainty, I was told, but like, high taxes or power cuts, it's just one inconvenience of life in a country that has many advantages. The white suburban Christians I came to know seem to view it as largely an administrative burden. Robbery, essentially means filling out forms and waiting in queues. I recall standing outside a church in central Cape Town talking with the minister when a friend of his walked up. Asked how he was, he replied, "He's fine, but my house was broken into the other day. And it's such a bother. I lost the whole morning waiting for the locksmith and the afternoon with the insurance company, and tomorrow I need to get my cards replaced." I don't think this is masculine posturing, rather a way of minimizing otherness, shrugging off property crime, even violent property crime, enacts an ordinary ethics of inclusive belonging. It's a rejection of a construction of white identity, as I mentioned, in circulation locally and globally, as a threatened group. Now I'm thinking because I'm not certain of this as a sort of a part of the secondary or the cleft habitus. Part of the contemporary South African kind of progressive Christian habitus that decenters the self. And it sort of picks up on a critique of South African whiteness from Sarah Nuttall, a literary theorist, who, to be fair, rather over relies on Coetzee's literature for her sense of South African whiteness. And Nikki Felkoff, who's written very well about satanic panic in late apartheid South Africa. But, the critique is that South African whiteness falls back on its own sort of self-care and private individual world. So white victimhood is really not part of the habitus. It's not part of the emotional toolkit for, my research participants, the way for some others, it's sort of their default modality. They encounter this world through the wronged subject. If anyone is, I kind of assume, with the paper that, there are certain things you cannot graduate without knowledge of. One of them is the Big Lebowski. So I'm assuming knowledge of that. If people think of the character Walter, his inability to differentiate between, time and space, everything is stuck in that same sort of moment of crisis and injustice, the Vietnam War, league bowling, so on and so on. His default modality, the way that he simply approaches that world, is as the wronged, the sinned against subject. Some of my Afrikaans friends would joke about this, ironically drawing attention to this idea of the victimized Afrikaans male. Now, moral triumphalism, or what Sarah Ahmed calls non-performative anti-racism, where acknowledging racism is seen to be the same movement, the same moment as overcoming racism, that wasn't really part of this either. Something else stood out in addition to this attitude towards crime, and that was the uniform for white males between 6 and 60. A t-shirt, sneakers, sandals or thongs, flip-flops if we put this on YouTube and Americans watch and get confused, and shorts, sometimes for some people, but not all, swapped for long trousers or jeans in the winter. It's oddly reminiscent of the old sort of apartheid era liberal English-speaking anti-Afrikaner joke about the Afrikaner who goes to London and he's so cold he puts on a second safari suit. But the way that white South African men dress is the precise embodiment of what the American literary scholar and historian Paul Fussell calls, refers to as a middle class sort of anti-class category X. When an X person, male or female, meets a member of an identifiable class, the costume, no matter what it is, conveys the message, I am freer and less terrified than you are. Since there's no one they think worth impressing more by mere appearance, X people tend to dress for themselves alone, which means they dress comfortably and generally down. Although their places are not inheritable, and although they lay little stress on manners, in their freedom, X people constitute a sort of parody aristocracy. They resemble Ian Forster's aristocracy of the sensitive. And the journalist Robert Armstrong sees Fussell as accurately prophesying our present era, in which most middle and upper class people dress, act and talk as members of a class that's created an aristocracy. And even before the current pandemic, Armstrong saw a hollowing out of the menswear market because weekend clothing, like jeans and sneakers, has become acceptable office wear. And something similar happened with women's professional fashion. Power casual began to replace office wear even before the pajama-inspired look we're all embracing now. So for many middle-class white men in South Africa and elsewhere, suits are only for weddings and funerals, a precise parallel with the emerging norm for churchgoers. Now, the embodiment of category X Californian style is Jeff the Dude Lebowski. He's first seen wearing a bathrobe over a t-shirt wandering around a supermarket. It is as if filmmakers decided to make the dude's wardrobe the ugliest parody of Californian style they could manage, Armstrong writes. And yet, how does the dude look? The dude looks resplendent, glorious and perfect. He inhabits his clothes as we all wish we could, as a second skin and an expression of his best self. They capture the dude's defining characteristic, his airy indifference to the expectations of the workaday world. Now, along with Fussell and Bourdieu and Franco Moretti, literary theorists, the dude's my key theoretical object for understanding white middle-class Protestants in Cape Town, as they sort of engage in this battle over the dominant art of life. The dude really ties the chapter together. Now, I borrow from Stacey Thompson's chapter in this collection, The Year's Work in Lebowski Study. And he argues the dude can be read in multiple ways, partly as the victory of the embodiment of the new left, the middle-class 60s student radicalism, focused on middle-class alienation and finding a life that is personally authentic. There was this, this sense that work is innately kind of degrading unless you can choose it and you can make it creative. So it's sort of best to avoid that. Living up to the values of the new left, the dude's life focuses more on leisure and no guilt. He only takes on work that personally interests him. The dude can also be read as the victory of kind of the old left because he seems to embody this kind of one-man utopian communism. He doesn't work, but all his needs are taken care of. His landlord reminds him he needs to pay the rent, but we don't get the sense he ever will. Instead, he seems to repay this by going to his landlord's dance recital. The catch is, Thompson argues, because the dude has reached this sort of promised communist utopia, he's not lazy, nor is he simply disinterested or comfortable, which is the language I take from Bourdieu and Moretti. The dude is without desire. And so the film's dramas kind of dissipate because the dude just doesn't care enough to follow anything true. So I would suggest that, this idea of the dude can be seen as the embodiment of the success of, the left. In some ways, you can see this, easy, casual, relaxed, white, liberal suburban South African. As as evidence of the triumph of apartheid. Follow me here, because the journalist Ryan Mallon argues that middle-class, white, liberal English-speaking suburbia was apartheid's most telling creation, constituting a Western moon base on Africa, a moon base where white South Africans live just like white Americans or Australians. From another perspective, the relaxedness of the South African white middle class is the very terror of the endpoint of apartheid by its Afrikaner architects, who were terrified that, you know, bourgeoisification would lead to liberalization and fragmentation, and it actually did. You know, it's including this sort of significant move over to Pentecostalism in the late apartheid era. As Ryan Mallon writes, in the 80s, Afrikaners had grown richer, more confident, and sophisticated as a result of decades of superior education and ethnic nepotism. So the confidence and education that Mallon points to here is the basis of one of the dominating arts of living among the South African elite. The other is conspicuous consumption and an effort on expanding social capital, basically expanding relationships, not just you know, expanding economic capital associated with the wealthy black middle class. So in distinction, Bourdieu cites two particular expressions of the dominant art of living set against the brutish necessity of ordinary existence, but against each other as well. One is luxury, you know, the distance from necessity, ostentatious freedom. The other is self-imposed constraint. But for Moretti, this constraint, for Bourdieu, he calls it comfort. And he cites comfort as a key term for understanding the development of middle-class morality, consciously set against, quoting Weber in The Protestant Ethic, the glitter and ostentation of feudal magnificence. So this kind of middle-class comfort also has a protective or a restorative element to it. We would call it part of the you know, the sort of the art of self-care. Now, Moretti observes a historical tension develop between this middle-class comfort on the one hand and middle-class luxury or fashion on the other. There's always a fraction of the middle class, generation after generation, that wants to go beyond itself, Moretti writes, setting itself apart from the down-to-earth practicality of middle-class comfort. Generation after generation, they replicate the glitter and ostentation of feudal magnificence. There was a very good article last weekend in the New York Times about the Hillsong Church in New York and its former pastor, head pastor, Carl Lentz. Quote, and the church's culture that worshipped wealth while making volunteers cater to leaders as royalty. This is wonderful illustration of this tension and this process of, you know, reversing to glitter and ostentation of feudal magnificence, because what Lentz was doing, he had contradicted the mega church's reputation for casual culture. And in reverting to feudal magnificence, he basically took on the life, almost literally, of a medieval bishop, who the critique of them, and I take this from Ewan Cameron, is that they treated their diocese as a source of income. They offered no pastoral care, and you never had any idea where they were. They were always off in Rome or something. Now, luxury and constrained comfort both signify ease. Well, they both symbolize freedom from constraints that dominate ordinary people. But ease can't be forced, Bourdieu argues. Ease that draws attention to itself undermines itself. Unforced ease is one reason why constraint or comfort is a notch above luxury. A person embracing luxury can manifest anxious tension. People with something to prove can appear, quote, possessed by the desire for possession, and so potentially possessed by the possessions they do not possess. That's just bravo, Bourdieu, for that sentence there. In the Big Lebowski, the dude is contrasted to the Big Lebowski, a multimillionaire with the same name, who is married into wealth and seeks every conventional symbolic expression of that wealth, including sponsoring a children's charity. The urban achievers, ambitious black youth who are in fact the real antithesis of the dude's actual comfort needs. In contrast to this luxury, genuine confidence is displayed when the bourgeoisie turns its own values against itself. As Bourdieu observes, whenever they seek to show that compared to the dominated, they are on the side of disinterestedness, freedom, purity, and for the soul. And so with the help of the dude, this is what I'm beginning to understand about the habitus of progressive white Christianity in South Africa. So thank you very much. I'll leave it there.